Now, the railways. I have my own memories of British Rail. I've been commuting on railways, goodness me, for 50 years on and off. I remember British Rail being absolutely ghastly. Nothing about it seemed to work whatsoever. And then privatisation came along in the 1980s. And I do believe there are areas, telecoms for example, where privatisation has been a huge success, given more consumer choice, given better value for money. And I think that privatisation project was the right thing to do all those years ago. But there are areas around utilities, and who knows, perhaps even railways, where I begin to ask myself a question: have we actually got this right? From what I can see of our railways today, and I'm going to get rid for a moment of the strikes that have bedeviled it for the last couple of years. From what I can see of our railways today, there are too many lines on which there are problems and delays. The price of travelling, if you go last minute, off-peak, say from London up north, can be £300, £350, is totally extortionate. The complexity of how to buy tickets from Euston Station and which company to go with is, I think, frankly, bedeviling. And there is a general feeling that whilst a lot of people still use the railways, and they do it, of course, because the roads are simply so busy and so unreliable in terms of time, there is a feeling that privatised railways are not working. And the Labour Party are going for this in no uncertain terms. Here was Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Hay speaking earlier on today.
They amount to the biggest reform of our railways for a generation. Labour will sweep away the broken model and bring private operators into public ownership as their contracts expire. We will establish Great British Railways, a single directing mind to control our railways in the passenger interest. We will deliver simplified fares and ticketing, a best fare guarantee across the network, as Trainline has already managed to achieve, and we will roll out the kinds of innovations that you have trialled here, digital season tickets and automatic delay repay, so that they are available to all passengers. And we will create a tough new passenger watchdog that will hold Great British Railways to account on behalf of the passenger, both on performance and on the quality of the service they provide. Labour will take a consciously different approach. We will see our workforce as an asset rather than a liability. We will work with them, and where there are disagreements, we will get around the table and we will work them out.
Well, it's perfectly clear. Labour will nationalise the railways. This is one of those policies that is unambiguous. It is clear. No, I made the point already. I did think in the 1980s it was right to privatise many things. But as that project went on, towards the end of Tory rule, I began to become questioning. I'll be honest with you. When it comes to renationalising the railways, I find myself in a very odd position. Normally, I sit here and talk to you on this show with absolutely firm opinions on subjects. On this one, as far as I'm concerned, personally, the jury is out. So I've got two guests for you that'll put both sides of the argument. It may convince me, it may convince you. I'm joined down the line from Wokingham by the Conservative Member of Parliament, Sir John Redwood, and joining me in the studio, Christian Woolmar, railway journalist, historian and former Labour politician. John, you were there in Number 10 as an advisor to Margaret Thatcher during the 1980s, and privatisation was a revolution. And I have to say, I believed much of it that we did in the 80s worked. As the years went on, we privatised more and more things, utilities, railways, etc. I looked, John, at the railways, even with my horrific memory of British Rail, and I asked myself, is railway privatisation actually working?
Well, first thing to stress is that we have a largely nationalised railway already, and so many of the things we dislike about the railway are the direct result of the government owning all of the track, all of the signals, all of the stations, and controlling the rest by controlling the timetables and quite a lot of the fares. So people who say they want to nationalise need to understand that it is largely done, and that we've had 22 years of very poor performance and big losses by Network Rail, which owns the whole track signals. and is often the cause of delay. So when your train is cancelled or delayed, it's often a signal failure or a line problem or a station problem, and that is a nationalised business working for you. When I was advising Margaret Thatcher, we decided not to privatise the railways. We have many better, easier cases, and as you rightly say, there were dramatic improvements in productivity, prices, availability, quality, in telecommunications, in electricity and gas. They worked extremely well. But there was always the need not merely to transfer ownership to get rid of the financial liability, to improve the financial management. There was also the need to have competition. And competition was absolutely crucial. And one of the reasons she and I did not go for the railways was it was more difficult to have a pro-competitive model. Under John Major, I was involved in the Ministerial Working Party on how you should do the railways. And I was the author of the Minority Report. And I was very, very keen on competitive challenge. Now, we've only been allowed it in one place, so that is Hull. And Hull was getting a very poor service from the regional monopoly that was privatised. And so they allowed another company to come along and provide a better service over their tracks. And that worked extremely well for Hull. And then the regional monopolies and the controllers in Whitehall never allowed it to happen anywhere else. So I say you need a competitive model to get choice, to get better quality, to get the prices down, to get closer to the customers. Network Rail itself, over its 22 years, has lost a lot of money, has required massive subsidies. They say on their balance sheet that all their track and stations and signals are worth £82 billion, but there's only 15 billion left as a taxpayer asset after 22 years of owning these amazing assets, because they borrowed so much and lost so much that the rest is all liability against it on the balance sheet. That's what you get with nationalisation. You run out of money and you have a rotten service.
So, John, I mean, the East Coast Line, for example, was losing money, so it's been effectively put under government control. So your argument is we haven't done it properly.
We should have had a pro-competitive model, and we shouldn't have nationalised Network Rail when Labour did. That has been a disaster.
OK, Christian Woolmer, you've listened to what John Redwood has said. He argues that Hull is one line where there is genuine competition between companies you can buy tickets from. But John's really arguing that it's half nationalised already.
Yes, I mean, I think that he's talking like one of those old Trotskyists who say, oh, yes, socialism would work. We've never really tried it. And when they kind of half try it, they say, no, we've never tried it enough. We really have to try it more. And I think he's suffering a bit from amnesia because actually they did privatise Network Rail. And what happened? It was Railtrack, as it was called then. It actually went bust because it messed up on its major contract on the West Coast Main Line. It had this meltdown after the Hatfield train crash, which resulted in delays everywhere. And that was the end of a privatised Network Rail. And the problem with that is that an infrastructure company like that is never going to have any competition, right? You just can't do that. You can't have two railway lines kind of competing against each other.
You can.
So, well, with great difficulty, Nigel. I mean, you know, you have a few places like London to Birmingham where you might have kind of different services, but by and large, you have, you know, a track one way and a track the other way, and you can't really have another set of tracks somewhere else. So the whole idea of privatising it to get competition.
But then track and rail was separated, weren't they? I mean, yes. an EU directive, actually, a 91 EU directive made sure...
that was used as an excuse, actually. But yes, I mean, since when do the Tories actually follow EU directives?
They always did. Sadly, they always... Let me ask you a question. The key question, you know, John makes the point we could have done this so much better.
Yeah.
You make the point that actually the whole idea is a dog's dinner to begin with. And I get both arguments. Right. Will full renationalisation of the railways give passengers a better, cheaper service?
Well, the Labour's suggestion is not going back to days of BR because the rolling stock has been sold off, the engineering companies have been sold off, so we're not getting full renationalisation. All we're getting is the train operators coming back in-house, and that makes a lot of sense because one of the real problems with privatisation was that they separated the track and the operations.
An EU directive did that.
the EU directive. No, the EU directive. Nigel, I've written books about this. The actual thing was just an accounting measure. Like across Europe, they did it as an accounting measure. They didn't have to separate it like that. Anyway, the idea now is that we bring them back together again and form a united rail company. And by the way, one of John Major's ideas that, again, John might have forgotten about, was actually to privatise the companies with the old big four companies like, London Midland and London North Eastern and so on. That would have been a much better way of privatising it, because you'd have got proper companies that ran the track and the operations as well together. And that would have been a much better idea. But that was rejected by ideologues like John Redwood, who insisted that competition was what we needed.
John Redwood, are you still there with me?
John Major rejected that. That was my minority report. I said you needed to keep track and trains together. You would do it on a regional basis, but they needed to be subject to competitive challenge, and there would be a regulator to adjudicate pricing of slots and allocation of slots, so that if the regional monopoly turned out to be bad for customers and bad on fares, there would be a challenge, and a regulator would use some of their slots for a competitor company. That was my model. So I don't know why I have to get insulted when somebody hasn't even read what I wrote about these things. Made it very clear at the time that it was much better to keep track and train together. It was indeed an EU regulation which made it extremely difficult to do that. And I suspect that's why my ideas were rejected. And I think if you'd had that with competitive challenge, you would have the advantages of the whole type operation across the network, and you'd have kept the regional monopolies honest. And it is much easier if somebody owns the track and signals and the trains. Of course it is. And one of the big faults of Network Rail in the last 22 years under both governments is they haven't put enough digital signalling in. And if they put digital signalling in, they've got a lot more capacity, more reliability, and more safety, because you get much more visibility and you can stop trains as soon as they get anywhere near another train if that starts to happen. And they didn't do that. And instead, they went for this enormously expensive idea of a London to Birmingham going on to the north additional railway line. Now, that wasn't Network Rail. What goes wrong when you go
that was not Network Rail,
because that has been completely nationalised throughout its life.
No.
Massively over budget, massively overrun, and now having to collapse itself because it was so badly administered.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100% on that. Actually, funny enough, the two of you are not that far away on several of these issues.
No, on HS2, absolutely agree. But it was not Network Rail. It's can't blame Network Rail.
But a fraction of the money that was spent on HS2, as John quite rightly says, could have improved our railways. Christian, Labour are going to do this, aren't they?
They are going to do this. And look, there will be massive savings. You can get rid of all those consultants and all those lawyers and all that delay attribution. I mean, there's hundreds of people whose sole job is to attribute who is responsible for delay so that you can charge either Network Rail or the train operator or the freight operator. That is all a nonsense. So having an integrated organisation is better. But the trouble is, I think John contradicts himself. You couldn't have these kind of regional companies and have competition at the same time.
I mean, John makes the point that it wasn't done properly, and he was very, very, very questioning about it back in the 90s. Either way, folks, at home, I think Christian Warmar's argument's winning. 70% of you think that actually the railways should be nationalised. Labour are going to win the election. It is going to happen, and we'll have a look at this again in a year or two's time to see whether it's any better. And goodness gracious me, I really hope that it is.
I'll come and tell you that.
No. We will come back to this subject again and again and again. Don't worry.